The knocking came close to midnight while I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes. Outside, my neighbor looked pale and uneasy. "I think you need to know something." "What is it?" I asked. He lowered his voice. "Last night I saw your husband's truck behind the shed." I frowned. "He's supposed to be out of state." The neighbor swallowed hard. He wasn't alone. A strange woman was with him. I stayed calm until I opened the bank statement hours later. Those numbers scared me even more. "I'm glad you're here for this one. Before we begin, do me a favor, drop a quick comment. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed what you thought you knew? Just yes or no. Your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to see today." Quick note, some details are fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. The message is what matters most. The knock came at 10:30 on a March night, when the only sound should have been wind through the oak trees. I stood at the kitchen sink in my log cabin outside Shelbyville, drying dishes from dinner I'd eaten alone again when I heard it. 3 sharp raps on the front door. Not the hesitant tap of a neighbor borrowing sugar, but the urgent knock of someone who needed to say something that wouldn't wait until morning. Boyd Hampton stood on my porch, 58 years old, still wearing his grease-stained work shirt from the garage he ran 2 miles down Route 41. His truck idled in my driveway, headlights cutting through the dark. "Leona," he said, "I don't mean to alarm you, but I saw lights behind your shed last night around 11. That truck looked like Vernon's." I dried my hands on the dish towel, slow and deliberate. "Vernon's on the Texas route. Left Sunday morning. I know what I saw." Boyd shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "And there was a woman with him." The dish towel stopped moving in my hands. At 59, I'd been scanning groceries at Kroger's register, 4 for 14 years, wearing the same green vest, watching the same fluorescent lights hum overhead. I knew how to keep my face calm when the numbers didn't add up, when a customer's card declined 3 times in a row, when life handed you information you weren't ready to receive. "You're certain it was his truck?" I asked. "Blue Ford F-150 Tennessee plates that dent in the rear fender from when he backed into the post at the gas station last year." Boyd's voice was steady, factual. "I was driving home late from fixing Earl Peterson's transmission. Saw flashlight beams moving behind your shed. Pulled over, cut my lights. Watched for about 5 minutes. Man and a woman digging or moving something. Couldn't see faces clear, but I know Vernon's truck." I invited Boyd inside, poured him coffee neither of us wanted. We sat at my kitchen table, the same pine table Vernon and I had bought 33 years ago when we got married, when I still believed in things like forever and fidelity. "Did Vernon say anything about coming back early from Texas?" Boyd asked. "No." I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, feeling the ceramic warm against my palms. "He called yesterday afternoon from a truck stop outside Dallas. Said he'd be gone through Friday." Boyd nodded slowly, set down his mug. "I'm sorry to bring this to you, Leona. Thought you should know." After he left, I stood at that door for a long time, looking out at the shed in the darkness, thinking about 33 years of marriage, about the way Vernon had been taking more overnight routes lately, about the new cologne I'd noticed in the bathroom, about the text messages he deleted before I could see them, about the bank statement I'd found that morning. I locked the door, turned off the kitchen light, and climbed the stairs to our bedroom. My bedroom really, since Vernon was gone more nights than he was home. I pulled the February statement from my jacket pocket where I'd hidden it, spread it on the bed under the lamp. There, 3rd line from the bottom. Transfer $800 to account ending in 4739. I didn't recognize the account number, didn't recognize the date. February 15th, a Tuesday a day. Vernon had been home, a day I'd been working my shift at Kroger. I pulled out January's statement from the drawer where I kept our financial papers, found the same line. Transfer $800 to account ending in 4739, January 15th, December, November, October, every month. The 15th of every month, $800. I didn't sleep that night. Sat at the kitchen table with 4 years of bank statements spread before me going back to March 2019, highlighting every transfer in yellow. Same amount, same account number, same date. When my alarm went off at 5:30, I'd already showered and dressed in my Kroger uniform, green vest, black pants name tag, pinned crooked because I'd never mastered getting it straight. I drove to work in the dark, parked in my usual spot under the oak tree at the edge of the lot, and walked through the automatic doors into the fluorescent brightness of the supermarket. "Morning, Leona," called Sandra from customer service. "Morning," I replied, clocking in, taking my position at register 4. The thing about being a cashier for 14 years is you learn to do simple math very, very quickly. $800 per month, 12 months per year, $9,600 per year, 4 years. I scanned a can of tomato soup. Beep. A box of cereal. Beep. A gallon of milk. Beep. "Good morning, Leona," said Mrs. Patterson, my first regular customer of the day. "How are you today?" "Just fine, thank you," I said, scanning her items while the calculation burned in my pocket along with that bank statement. $38,400. I rang up 12 customers before my first break. Walked to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and pulled out the statement again. Did the math 3 more times on the back of a receipt. Same answer every time. $38,400. Transferred systematically, methodically on the 15th of every month for 4 years, while I scanned groceries under fluorescent lights, and Vernon drove his routes and told me everything was fine, we were fine, the bills were paid, and the account was healthy. I returned to register 4, scanned more soup, more cereal, more milk, smiled at customers, made change, thanked them for shopping at Kroger, and in my pocket that statement felt like it weighed 10 pounds. The question wasn't whether Vernon was stealing from our joint account anymore. The question was what he was spending it on and who that woman behind the shed really was. I sat in my car in the Kroger parking lot for 15 minutes before I could make myself dial Flynn's number. My shift had ended at 3. The March sun slanted through the windshield, warming my face, but my hands felt cold against the steering wheel. Around me, shoppers pushed carts to their cars, loaded groceries drove away to normal lives where husbands didn't steal money and dig holes in the middle of the night with women who weren't their wives. I pulled out my phone, stared at Flynn's contact photo, him grinning at a job site, last summer tool belt slung low safety vest, bright against the Tennessee sky. My son, 27 years old, the one who always answered when I called. I pressed dial. 3 rings, then his voice steady and familiar. "Hey Mom, what's up?" "Flynn, are you free this weekend?" I kept my tone light, careful. "I need you to come home." The pause lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I heard everything in it, the shift from casual to alert, the way he'd learned to read the spaces between my words. "What's wrong, Mom?" "No more lightness. All attention. Nothing I can explain over the phone." I watched a woman wrestle a cart into the return corral, metal clanging against metal. "Can you come Saturday morning? I'll be there by 9. No hesitation. No questions about his schedule or the jobs he'd have to reschedule. "Does Dad know you're calling me?" "Your father's in Texas. He won't be back until Friday night." Another pause, this one heavier. "Okay, I'll see you Saturday." I hung up and sat there in the parking lot until the sun dropped below the tree line, holding onto the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in the world. You learn things about your children that surprise you even after 27 years. Flynn had always been quieter than his sister Thalia, less dramatic, the kind of boy who fixed things instead of talking about them. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned to hear what I didn't say. The kind of knowing that only comes from watching a parent hold herself together through years of small disappointments and careful silences. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. I'd barely slept lying awake listening to the house settle, wondering what Vernon was doing in that motel room in Texas, or if he was even in Texas at all. Flynn's work van pulled into my driveway at 8:53, 7 minutes early. He climbed out wearing his tool belt, the leather worn smooth from daily use, his work boots, dusty from whatever job he'd left to come here. I met him at the door. He pulled me into a hug without speaking, and I let myself lean into it for exactly 3 seconds before stepping back. "Coffee's ready," I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd sat with Boyd Hampton 4 nights ago. I spread the bank statements between us like evidence at a trial. 4 years of transfers, I said, pointing to the highlighted lines. Same amount, same date every month. I don't recognize the account number. Flynn studied the papers, his jaw tight. He had Vernon's gray eyes, but that's where the resemblance ended. Everything else, the careful attention, the quiet strength, The way he listened before speaking, that was mine. How much total, he asked. Just over 38,000. He looked up sharply. Jesus, Mom, there's more. I told him about Boyd's warning, about Vernon's truck behind the shed on Tuesday night, about the woman Boyd saw. Kept my voice level, factual, the same tone I used to read grocery prices to customers who couldn't see the screen. Vernon told me he was in Dallas that night, called me from a truck stop at 5 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. Let me look at the shed, Flynn said, already standing. I watched from the kitchen window as he walked across the brown grass toward the old storage shed my father had built 30 years ago. Flynn held his phone up, taking photos, walking in a slow grid pattern. He crouched near the south corner, then moved to the east side, then around to the back where I couldn't see him anymore. 15 minutes passed. I poured myself another cup of coffee I wouldn't drink and stood at the window watching the spot where Flynn had disappeared. I thought about the land my father left me when he died 14 years ago. 80 acres of Tennessee hills and oak trees, a log cabin, a warehouse for the construction business he'd run until a stroke took him at 72. He'd never explained why the land went to me instead of being split with my brother. Never explained the odd parcels the way some sections didn't quite connect the warehouse that seemed too big for the business he'd actually run. My mother had died 2 years before him. Their belongings still sat in boxes in my basement untouched since 2010 because sorting through your parents' lives requires an energy I'd never quite found. Flynn came back through the kitchen door, his face grim. "Show me," I said. He spread his phone on the table, swiping through photos. Disturbed earth in 3 separate locations. The dirt looked freshly moved, carelessly refilled grass, torn and dying at the edges. "This one's maybe 6 feet from the shed's south corner," Flynn said, pointing. "This one's about 15 feet east. This one's around back near that old oak stump." When I asked, "Hard to say exactly, but the grass die-off suggests within the last 2 months. Maybe less." I stared at the photos. 3 holes. 3 separate attempts at something. "He refilled them himself," Flynn continued. "You can see where the dirt's different textures, clay mixed with topsoil not layered right. Someone who knew what they were doing would have put it back the way they found it." "Vernon was never good at details," I said quietly. Flynn looked at me with those gray eyes that should have been his father's but somehow weren't. "Mom, he's looking for something, and whatever it is, he hasn't found it yet." The kitchen felt smaller, suddenly the walls pressing in. Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees, the same sound I'd heard all my life on this land. "What could he possibly think is buried out there?" I asked. Flynn shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but he's spending a lot of money and taking a lot of risk to find it." Flynn spent Sunday afternoon running wire from the shed corner to the fence post, his electrician's hands working with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching him work, a mug of coffee going cold in my hands. He'd driven to Nashville that morning and come back with 2 small cameras, the kind electricians use for inspection work, he'd explained. Compact, weather-resistant, motion-activated, the kind no one would notice unless they knew exactly where to look. "These will record motion and send alerts to my phone," Flynn said, mounting the first camera in the corner of the shed's eave, angling it downward to cover the area where the dig site scarred the earth. "He won't know they're here." "What if he sees them?" "He won't. They're the same color as the wood trim and they're smaller than a deck of cards." Flynn moved to the fence post 20 feet away, installing the second camera with the same careful precision. "This one covers the approach. If anyone comes back here at night, we'll know." I watched him work and thought about my father. Thomas Whitfield had owned these 80 acres for 43 years before his stroke took him in 2010. Bought the land in 1967 with money he'd saved from working construction, built the log cabin himself board by board, started a small warehouse business that kept us fed but never quite thrived, and in all those years, through recessions and medical bills and my brother's college tuition and the 100 small financial crises that come with raising a family, my father never once considered selling this land. Not even when the offers came, and they did come regularly from developers who saw the highway access and the oak trees and the gently rolling Tennessee hills. "Your grandfather never told me why this land mattered so much to him," I said. Flynn looked up from his work screwdriver in hand. Did you ever ask? No. The truth of it settled heavy. I just assumed he loved it. The way some people love a place without needing a reason. Maybe he didn't need to tell you, Flynn said, climbing down from the fence post. Maybe he just wanted you to have it. We walked back to the house together, the March wind cold against our faces. Inside, I made sandwiches. Neither of us ate, while Flynn showed me the camera app on his phone. 2 live feeds clear enough to see the shed corner and the disturbed earth. I'll check it every night, he said. If Vernon comes back. When he comes back, I corrected quietly. Flynn nodded. When he comes back, we'll have proof. He left before dark, hugging me at the door, telling me to call if I needed anything. I stood at the window, watching his van disappear down the driveway, then turned to face the empty house. My parents' belongings sat in boxes in the storage room off the kitchen untouched, since my mother died in 2009 and my father followed a year later. 14 years of cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape, labeled in my mother's careful handwriting. Papers, photos, Thomas's office, kitchen misc. I'd meant to sort through them, meant to 1,000 times. But sorting through your parents' lives requires an energy I'd never quite found. And then the years passed, and the boxes became part of the landscape, just another thing I'd get to someday. I looked at those boxes now with different eyes. I want to tell you about the moment you stop seeing someone you've loved for 33 years and start seeing the stranger wearing their face. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a dramatic revelation with music swelling in the background. It's quieter than that, slower. Vernon Hargrove pulled his rig into the driveway Monday evening around 761-years-old boots, heavy on gravel, smiling the way he always did after the long haul from Texas. I heard the air brakes hiss, heard the diesel engine rumble into silence, heard his footsteps on the porch. He came through the door carrying a paper grocery bag from some Texas supermarket, still in his work clothes, smelling of truck stop coffee and highway diesel. "Hey, honey," he said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Brought you those pecan pralines you like from that place in Amarillo." "That's thoughtful," I said, drying my hands on a dish towel. "How was the drive?" "Long, same as always." He pulled off his boots, lined them up by the door with the same careful precision he'd used for 33 years. Roads through Arkansas were hell construction all the way through Little Rock, added 2 hours to the trip. He moved through the house like he always did after a long haul, checking the mail, pouring himself coffee, settling into his recliner with a satisfied sigh. Normal. Completely, utterly normal. "Flynn doing okay?" Vernon asked, casual as commenting on the weather. "Saw his van was here over the weekend. Just stopped by to fix the outlet in the spare bedroom." I lied smoothly. "It's been sparking." "Good boy. Always thinking of his mother." Vernon smiled at me over his coffee cup. "Unlike some kids who only call when they need money." He meant Thalia, our daughter who lived in Nashville with her marketing job and her expensive apartment and her careful distance from both of us. He smiled at me across the kitchen table, that same smile I'd watched over breakfast for 33 years, and for the first time I saw it for what it was. Performance? Practiced ease. The comfortable confidence of a man who believed his wife was too simple, too trusting, too busy with her Kroger register and her grocery coupons to ever understand what he was really doing. That night, Vernon asked if I wanted to watch a movie like we did most Monday evenings. I said yes. I made popcorn in the microwave the way he liked it, with extra butter. We sat on the couch together, his arm around my shoulders, watching some action film he'd picked. I laughed at the parts he found funny, commented on the plot, leaned against him during the quiet scenes. And the whole time I thought about the cameras Flynn installed, already recording in the dark behind the shed, waiting for Vernon to come back with his shovel and his secrets, and the woman Boyd had seen. I wondered how long he'd been smiling at me like this, like I was too simple to ever understand what he was really doing. Marlene Hargrove arrived that Saturday afternoon the way she always did, like she was doing me a favor by sitting in my living room. The week had passed slowly since Vernon's return from Texas. We'd fallen back into our routine like actors who'd performed the same play for 33 years. He drove local routes Tuesday through Thursday. I worked my shifts at Kroger. We ate dinner together, watched television, went to bed in the same room where we'd slept since 1990. And every night I checked my phone to see Flynn's surveillance feed, watching the empty darkness behind the shed, waiting for Vernon to reveal himself. Marlene swept through my front door at 2 o'clock, 56 years old, wearing a blue cardigan and that pleased expression she always carried when visiting her younger brother's wife. She settled onto my couch like she owned the place, crossing her legs at the ankle the way our mother-in-law had taught both Hargrove women decades ago. "Leona, you look tired," she said, which was her way of saying I looked old. "Are you sleeping well?" "Just fine, thank you." I poured tea into the good china cups I kept for guests I didn't particularly like. "How have you been, Marlene?" "Busy as always. The garden club has me running ragged with the spring fundraiser." She accepted her cup with a gracious nod. "Vernon works so hard on those Texas roots. You're lucky to have a husband like that." "I am," I said, sitting across from her in the chair Vernon usually occupied. "Would you like sugar?" "Just a touch." She watched me add the sugar, stirring it 3 times clockwise the way she'd been taught. "Thomas left you this land, didn't he? When he passed?" "Yes, 14 years ago now." "Such a generous father. Though I suppose Vernon's done well managing it all for you." She said it lightly, conversationally, as if stating simple fact. "Men understand property and finances in ways we don't. Don't they?" I sipped my tea and said nothing. "My ex-husband used to travel for work too." Marlene continued, her voice shifting slightly. "Insurance sales, gone 3-4 days a week sometimes. She'd been divorced for 12 years. I'd never heard her mention her ex-husband except in the context of legal proceedings and property division. "That must have been difficult," I said carefully. Marlene's face did something strange. Then a brief crack in the pleasant mask, a flash of old pain crossing her features like a shadow. "It was. That never ended well." The moment passed quickly. She smoothed it away with another sip of tea, another comment about the garden club, another observation about how well Vernon provided for his family. But I'd seen it. That flicker of recognition, that knowledge. Marlene Hargrove knew what it felt like to be betrayed by a traveling husband. There's a particular kind of invisible you become when you work behind a cash register for 14 years. People look at you without seeing you, talk to you without hearing you. They stand in your line discussing their lives, their problems, their secrets, as if the woman in the green vest is just part of the machinery, no more capable of understanding than the scanner that beeps over their groceries. Marlene saw me the same way. A simple woman who'd been lucky enough to marry into the Hargrove family, lucky enough to inherit land from a father who'd worked himself to death, lucky enough to have Vernon managing it all, because heaven knows Leona couldn't handle such complexities herself. She left at 4, kissing my cheek at the door, reminding me to take my vitamins and get more sleep. I waved from the porch, watching her car disappear down the driveway, and thought about that flash of pain on her face. Tuesday night, after Vernon left for a Nashville delivery, I went to the storage room. The cardboard boxes sat where they'd sat for 14 years, stacked against the wall beneath a small window that faced the backyard. I'd labeled them when I packed up my parents' house in 2010, numbering them 1 through 18 in black marker. Kitchen, bedroom, office, photos. I pulled down box 7, Thomas's office, and carried it to the storage room floor. The packing tape cracked when I cut it brittle with age. Inside, old receipts, tax documents, business ledgers from the small construction warehouse my father had run until his stroke. And beneath it all, a small brown leather-bound notebook. I sat on the storage room floor, surrounded by 14-year-old dust, and held my father's notebook in both hands. And for the first time since Boyd knocked on my door, I felt something besides fear. My father's handwriting covered the pages, agricultural notes about soil quality and oak tree growth, seasonal calendars marking planting and harvest times, family expenses from the 1980s and 1990s, tracked in his careful columns. I flipped through, slowly reading his notes about a drought in 1993, a particularly good corn year in 1998, the cost of replacing the warehouse roof in 2004. The last page stopped me cold. A hand-drawn diagram of the property, simple lines indicating the cabin, the shed, the fence line, an arrow pointing to the northeast corner of the old shed, an X. and beneath it, in my father's familiar handwriting, "For Leona when needed." I stared at those 5 words until they blurred, read them again, traced them with my finger. For Leona when needed. My father had known something, known enough to bury something specifically for me, mark it with my name, tuck the diagram into a notebook I'd find only when sorting through his belongings. Known enough to write "when needed," not "if needed," as if he'd understood that someday, somehow, I would need whatever he'd left. I pulled out my phone, compared the diagram to a mental map of the property. The X marked the northeast corner of the shed where my father had laid the foundation himself in 1993, when I was 29 years old and newly married, 40 feet from the 3 holes Vernon had dug. I flipped the diagram over and over under the storage room's single yellow bulb, my father's notebook heavy in my hands. Vernon had been searching for months, maybe years, digging in the wrong place. And whatever my father had buried, whatever he'd marked with my name and an arrow, and the promise that I'd need it, sat untouched beneath the corner of a shed built 30 years ago. But what Vernon was looking for and what my father had actually left for me might not be the same thing at all. Flynn picked me up in a rental car I'd never seen before, a gray sedan so ordinary it could have been invisible. I'd spent the days since finding my father's notebook trying to decide what to investigate first, the X my father had marked, or the holes Vernon had dug, searching for something else entirely. In the end, the decision was simple. My father's gift had waited for me since 1987. It could wait a few more days. Vernon's secrets, on the other hand, were happening now. Flynn had checked the surveillance footage every night for 2 weeks. Nothing. Vernon hadn't returned to dig since that night Boyd saw him in March. But Vernon's next Texas route was scheduled for Thursday, and Flynn had a plan. "Rental car," he'd explained on the phone. "Gray or beige, something forgettable. We follow him, see where he actually goes. And if he sees us, he won't. I've tailed contractors to job sites when they claim they're working but aren't. You stay 3 cars back, you don't make eye contact, you blend in." So Thursday evening at 5:30, I climbed into Flynn's rental car wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap I'd borrowed from Vernon's closet. The irony wasn't lost on me, hiding under my husband's hat to follow my husband to his mistress. We parked 2 blocks from our house and waited. At 6:15, Vernon's rig rumbled past us, heading toward Interstate 24. Flynn let 2 cars pass, then pulled out behind them, settling into the flow of traffic. "Remember?" Flynn said quietly. "Don't look at him directly. Don't do anything that draws attention." I nodded, watching Vernon's truck 3 vehicles ahead, his familiar driving habits suddenly strange from this perspective. The way he changed lanes without signaling, the way he rode slightly left of center. We followed him onto the interstate, maintaining distance. The sun dropped behind the hills, turning the Tennessee sky orange and purple. Traffic thinned as we left Shelbyville behind. "Depot's coming up in 5 miles, Flynn said. "Exit 78. I knew. I'd driven this route 100 times when Vernon first started the Texas runs, back when I used to meet him at the depot with dinner when he worked late. Exit 78 approached. Vernon's blinker didn't come on. "That's not the depot exit," Flynn said, his voice tight. "Where's he going?" "I don't know. Keep following." Vernon stayed on Interstate 24, continuing northwest. Exit 78 disappeared behind us. My stomach dropped. "Clarksville," I said quietly. "He's heading to Clarksville." There's a particular kind of silence between a mother and son when you're both watching the same terrible truth unfold in real time. Flynn's hands gripped the steering wheel. I sat perfectly still, watching Vernon's truck roll down the highway toward a destination he'd never mentioned in 33 years of marriage. Clarksville appeared on the horizon, lights glowing against the darkening sky. Vernon took exit 11, turning onto a suburban road lined with modest houses and streetlights just beginning to flicker on. Flynn followed, dropping back farther now that traffic had thinned. "Stay back," I whispered, though Flynn didn't need the reminder. Vernon turned onto Maple Grove Drive. Small ranch houses, neat lawns, basketball hoops and driveways. The kind of neighborhood where families lived, where children grew up. Vernon's truck slowed, then pulled into a driveway 3 houses down on the left. A small brick ranch with white trim. Flower pots by the front door, petunias. I thought, though, it was hard to see in the dimming light. The curtains were drawn, but warm light glowed behind them. Flynn drove past slowly, then turned at the corner and parked 1 block away, killing the engine. We sat in darkness. "Mom," Flynn said softly, "that house, someone's living there. Look at the flower pots. The lawn's mowed." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Just watch Vernon's truck sitting in that driveway like it belonged there. The front door's porch light came on. Vernon climbed out of his truck, not hurrying, not looking around nervously, just walking toward that front door the way he walked toward our door every night after work. Casual, expected, home. The window curtains parted an inch. A woman's hand, I was certain, pulling them aside to look out at Vernon's truck. Then they closed again. I want you to understand what it feels like to sit in a dark car and watch your husband of 33 years walk up to a house you've never seen before, like he owns it. To watch him reach for the doorknob, not knocking, not waiting, just opening the door and stepping inside like he has every right to be there. The door closed behind him. The porch light stayed on. Flynn and I sat there in the darkness, 1 block away, far enough that Vernon wouldn't see us, close enough to see everything. "How long has he?" Flynn started, then stopped. "I don't know. The money, the transfers. This is where it's been going." A second house. My voice sounded strange, distant. All this time, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet. Somewhere down the street, children laughed. A dog barked. Normal sounds from a normal street where normal families lived normal lives. Except one of those families included my husband. I thought about the monthly transfers. $9,600 a year, enough to cover rent on a place like this, utilities, groceries for 2 people, maybe more than 2 people. I thought about the 3 holes behind my shed, Vernon digging in the wrong place, searching for something on my father's land, something he needed badly enough to risk discovery. I thought about my father's diagram, the X marked 40 feet away, the words, "For Leona when needed." I'd needed proof. Now I had it. The curtains parted again, just an inch. That woman's hand pulling them aside. I could see her silhouette now, watching Vernon's truck in the driveway. Then the curtains closed and Vernon walked to the front door, not the side entrance or the back, but straight to the front, like he had every right to be there. Flynn turned off our headlights. We sat there in the darkness 1 block away, and I understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't a temporary affair or a moment of weakness. This was a life Vernon had built, a home he maintained, a woman who waited for him behind curtains with petunias by the front door. What I didn't know yet was that when that door opened again, I'd see exactly who Vernon had been spending my inheritance on. The door opened before Vernon even reached it, and a woman stepped out to meet him on the porch. She was younger than me. That was the first thing I noticed. 34, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a cardigan wrapped around her shoulders against the April evening chill. She smiled when she saw Vernon, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and walked straight to him. Not the careful approach of a mistress checking for witnesses, not the furtive glance of someone doing something wrong. She walked to him the way I used to walk to him 33 years ago when he came home from work, and I was still young and didn't know what our marriage would become. She wrapped her arms around him. He pulled her close. They stood there on that porch under the yellow light holding each other, and she took his jacket and laughed at something he said and touched his face the way you touch someone who belongs to you. "Mom," Flynn whispered beside me, his voice tight. "Are you seeing this? Record everything I said." Flynn raised his phone, pointing it toward that house, that porch, that woman in Vernon's arms. The camera shutter sound was off, but I heard the soft tap of his finger against the screen. Tap, tap, tap. "She's acting like," Flynn's voice cracked slightly, "like he lives there." "He does," I said quietly. "That's exactly what this is." I need you to understand the difference between knowing your husband is unfaithful and watching him be happy with someone else in a way he never was with you. Infidelity is one kind of pain, sharp, immediate, the kind that makes you gasp. But watching your husband of 33 years laugh with another woman, touch her face with tenderness you haven't seen in a decade, walk into a house he's built with money he stole from you, that's a different kind of pain entirely. That's the kind that doesn't make you gasp. It makes you go very, very still. Cressida Ashford. I'd learn her name later from the mailbox at the end of the driveway, stood on that porch with my husband and looked happy. Not guilty, not nervous, happy. They went inside together, the door closed, the porch light stayed on. Flynn and I sat in that dark rental car and waited. How long do we? Flynn started. As long as it takes, I said. The neighborhood settled into evening. Lights came on in houses up and down the street, families sitting down to dinner, children finishing homework, normal Thursday night routines in normal houses with normal families. Except for the house 3 doors down where my husband was living a second life I'd paid for. An hour passed, maybe more. I'd stopped checking the time. Flynn had put his phone down, hands gripping the steering wheel like he needed something solid to hold on to. Then movement in the front window caught my eye. The curtains were sheer enough to see shapes moving behind them, the warm glow of lamps, furniture I'd never seen, a life I'd never known about. And then a small figure ran into view. A child, brown hair, maybe 4 years old. He ran straight toward Vernon, who was sitting on a couch I'd never picked out in a living room I'd never decorated in a house I'd never known existed. The boy launched himself at Vernon. Vernon caught him, lifted him high, spun him around. Through the window, even from a block away, I could see them both laughing. "Mom," Flynn whispered. "That kid. He looks just like—" "I know." Flynn raised his phone again, started recording. His hands shook slightly. Through that window, Vernon spun that little boy around and around, and the boy shrieked with laughter, and I realized I'd never once heard Vernon laugh like that. Not with Flynn, not with Joelle, not with me, not in 27 years of raising our children together, not in 33 years of marriage. The boy had Vernon's hair, Vernon's build. Even from this distance, even through a window, the resemblance was unmistakable. "How old is he?" Flynn asked quietly. 4, maybe, 4.5. Flynn did the math the same moment I did. I heard his sharp intake of breath. 2019, he said. "Yes. I moved out in September 2019. I know. Joelle got married in April 2019. I know." Flynn's voice went very quiet. "We were all still home." Inside the rental house, Cressida came into view carrying something, a plate, maybe dinner. She set it on a coffee table. Vernon set the boy down, ruffled his hair, said something that made the child giggle. Cressida sat beside Vernon on the couch. The boy climbed between them. A family, complete, whole, happy, built with money stolen from my inheritance. Built while Vernon came home to me every night, climbed into our bed, kissed me goodnight, told me he loved me. "I need to get out of this car," Flynn said suddenly. "Not yet." "Mom, I can't just sit here watching this." "Yes, you can." My voice came out harder than I intended. "Because we need proof. We need documentation. We need every piece of evidence we can get before we do anything else." Flynn's jaw clenched, but he stayed in his seat, kept recording. We sat there for another 30 minutes, watched Vernon help the boy with something, a toy maybe, watched Cressida bring drinks, watched them settle in for a normal evening, watched Vernon check his watch, stand up, kiss Cressida goodbye, kiss the boy's forehead, getting ready to leave, to drive back to Shelbyville, to climb into bed beside me and pretend he'd been in Texas all week. 4 years old. I sat in that dark car with Flynn's phone still recording, watching Vernon set the boy down and ruffle his brown hair, Vernon's hair, Vernon's eyes, Vernon's smile. 4 years meant 2019. Flynn moved out in September 2019. Joelle got married in April 2019. That child was conceived while we were all still living in that house together, while I was still making Vernon coffee every morning and asking about his roots and believing every word he said. And the worst part was knowing he'd come home from this house, from this woman, from this child, and climbed into bed beside me like nothing had changed. I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, listening to my husband promise another woman my inheritance. Vernon had come home from Clarksville that Thursday, just like Flynn predicted. Pulled into the driveway at midnight, climbed into bed beside me, kissed my shoulder like he always did when he thought I was sleeping. The smell of Cressida's perfume still faint on his shirt. I'd lain there in the dark, not moving, not breathing, while he settled in beside me and fell asleep within minutes. The sleep of a man with nothing to hide. the sleep of a man who believed his wife was too simple to ever figure him out. 2 days later, I heard him on the phone. I'd gotten up for water around 11, padding down the hallway in bare feet, when I heard his voice through our bedroom door, left slightly ajar because Vernon hated sleeping in a completely closed room. His voice was low, intimate, the tone he used to use with me before the years wore us down into polite strangers. "Just wait a little longer, baby," he said softly. "When I finish this." I stopped in the hallway shadows, my hand frozen on the water glass. I know," Vernon continued. "Hugo deserves better than a rental. You both do. That's why I need to get this right." A pause. Cressida saying something I couldn't hear. "The land, Cress. When I get the land, we can sell it and take you and Hugo anywhere you want. California, Florida, somewhere fresh where nobody knows us." Another pause. "She won't fight it. Trust me. She doesn't understand property law, doesn't understand how marital assets work. By the time she figures out what's happening, it'll be done. The land will be mine and no one can stop us." I stood there in the dark hallway, my father's 80 acres hanging in the balance of my husband's whispered promises to another woman. This wasn't just about the affair, wasn't just about the money he'd stolen, or the child he'd fathered, or the double life he'd been living. This was about erasing me completely. There's a specific kind of stillness that comes over you when you realize the person you've trusted for 33 years has been planning your erasure in precise detail. Not heat, not rage, not the dramatic fury of movies and novels, just cold, absolute clarity. Every piece clicking into place with the precision of a lock tumbling open. The digging behind the shed, the stolen money, the affair with Cressida, the 4-year-old son, all of it leading to one goal. Take the land my father left me, sell it, fund a new life with a new family, and leave me with nothing. I set the water glass down on the hallway table, silent as a ghost. Walked back to the guest bedroom where I'd been sleeping since we got home from Clarksville, claiming I had a cold and didn't want to keep Vernon up with my coughing. He'd accepted that without question. Of course he had. In his mind, I was too simple to suspect anything. The next 3 evenings after Vernon went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a small desk lamp and my laptop and reprinted 4 years of joint account statements. 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. I went through them line by line with a yellow highlighter marking every transfer to account number ending in 4739. The account I didn't recognize. The account Vernon had opened without telling me. March 2019, $800. April 2019, $800. May 2019, $1,000. The amounts increased as the months went on. By 2021, he was transferring $1, $200 every month like clockwork. Sometimes more, sometimes an extra $500 here, $700 there. I added them up on a legal pad with my father's old mechanical pencil, the one I'd found in his notebook with the property diagram. Wrote the numbers in neat columns, double-checked my arithmetic 3 times. Transfers to unknown account, $47, $200. But that wasn't all. I sat at that table with papers stacked in neat columns, 4 years of theft, organized by month, by amount, by lie. And the only sound was the kitchen clock ticking past midnight. There were the car repairs Vernon claimed he'd paid for. 5 different mechanics over 4 years, no receipts, always cash. Lost the receipt, honey, but the truck runs great now. $8,000 in phantom repairs. There were the long-distance driving expenses. Vernon drove for work, yes, but his company reimbursed him for fuel and tolls. The personal mileage charges on our joint account, the ones he said were for visiting his cousin in Knoxville, for checking on Marlene when she had surgery for that weekend fishing trip with Boyd that Boyd had later mentioned never happened. $15,000 per year in unexplained mileage and fuel. There were the business dinners he needed to attend, the overnight depot fees that didn't match the company's standard rates, the truck maintenance fund he insisted we needed to keep separate. I added it all up. $47, $200 in direct transfers, $32,000 in phantom repairs and mileage, $12,000 in fabricated business expenses. I stared at the number for a long time. $91,200. 4 years. 48 months of Vernon systematically bleeding our joint account to fund Cressida and Hugo, while I worked 56-hour weeks at Kroger scanning groceries under fluorescent lights, coming home to make dinner for a husband who was planning to steal everything my father left me. I thought about my green vest, my crooked name tag, my 14 years behind Register 4. I thought about calculating how many shifts that was, how many hours, how many thousands of scanned items. $8.75 per hour when I started, $10.40 now. Time and a half for anything over 40 hours. I picked up my father's pencil, started to do the math, then set it down again. No, I wasn't going to calculate it, because if I did the math, I'd know exactly how many hours I'd work to pay for my own replacement. $90,000. I wrote the number at the bottom of the final page in my father's old mechanical pencil. $90,000 stolen from our joint account to fund Vernon's second life with Cressida and Hugo, while I scanned groceries at Register 456 hours a week, wearing that green vest with my name tag crooked. I didn't calculate how many shifts that was. I couldn't, because if I did, I'd have to face exactly how long I'd been working to finance the life that was supposed to replace mine. Flynn's laptop screen glowed blue in the dark kitchen, showing my husband digging holes behind our shed at 2 a.m. I decided not to count the shifts or calculate the hours. Instead, I folded those financial documents into a manila folder, filed them behind winter coats Vernon never touched, and focused on evidence. Flynn had monitored the surveillance cameras for 8 weeks. Most nights, nothing. Just empty darkness behind the shed night vision, turning everything gray-green. But 11 nights Vernon appeared. "Watch this," Flynn said, scrubbing through footage on his laptop. Vernon was on a Nashville route until Friday, so we sat at the kitchen counter reviewing what Flynn had compiled. May 3rd, 1:47 a.m. Vernon's truck at the shed. Shovel and battery lantern. Digs 43 minutes. Climbs out empty-handed. Fills the hole. Drives away. May 8th, 2:13 a.m., same location, 37 minutes, nothing. May 15th, 12:52 a.m., same spot, 51 minutes, nothing. 11 times, Flynn said quietly. Same spot every time. Show me the diagram overlay. Flynn pulled out his phone, opened my father's diagram, then a satellite view of our property. He matched the landmarks: shed fence line, old oak stump. He's digging here. Flynn pointed to Vernon's location on the surveillance footage. Then he pointed to the X on my father's diagram. Dad's X is 40 feet that way, northeast corner of the shed foundation. I stared at the screens. He's been digging in the wrong place, I said. The whole time, months, maybe years, and whatever Dad buried is still there. I want you to understand what it feels like to discover you're 40 feet ahead of the person who's been trying to destroy you. It's not triumph. Not yet. It's cold, strategic satisfaction. It's knowing you hold a card your opponent doesn't realize is in the deck. Vernon had stolen $90,000, maintained a second family, dug 11 holes in 8 weeks, all while searching in the wrong location. The real treasure sat untouched beneath the shed's northeast corner. "Don't excavate it yet," Flynn said. "Not until we know Vernon's next move." Agreed. 3 days later, Vernon placed papers on the kitchen table. I was making coffee before my 11 o'clock Kroger shift when Vernon came in carrying a manila folder. He set it down carefully, deliberately. "Hey, honey," he said. "I need to talk to you about something." I poured my coffee, added cream, turned to face him. "What is it?" "There's an old loan from 2021. Deadline's coming up. We need to sell some land to cover it." I sipped my coffee, kept my face neutral. "What loan?" "From when I bought the new rig." Vernon pulled papers from the folder. "We took out a secured loan using the land as collateral. You signed the papers. Remember?" "I don't recall that." "It's been 3 years." Vernon watched me carefully. "You probably forgot." I set down my coffee and picked up the papers. Loan agreement dated March 15, 2021. Principal $65,000. Secured by 80 acres in Shelbyville. Due May 31st, 2023. I scanned the term's interest rate payment schedule. At the bottom, 2 signatures. Vernon's bold and familiar, and mine. Leona Hargrove, dated March 15, 2021. I stared at that signature. The handwriting was close someone had practiced. The slant was right. The size was right, but the capital L was wrong. I've signed my name the same way for 41 years. The capital L in Leona has a specific loop, a flourish my third-grade teacher taught me. It's distinctive enough that bank tellers recognize it. This L was generic, standard, the kind anyone would write without knowing the specific way I formed mine. That signature wasn't mine. I saw it the moment my eyes landed on the page, but I looked at Vernon and smiled and said I'd double-check my records, and he believed me. This is dated March 2021. I asked, voice carefully neutral. Yeah, you don't remember signing it? I looked up at Vernon. He was watching intently, trying to read my reaction, trying to see if his stupid cashier wife was smart enough to recognize her own forged signature. Let me pull my files, I said calmly. I keep copies of everything. I'll double-check this against my 2021 records. Vernon's shoulders relaxed. He smiled. Yeah, good idea. It's probably fine, but you know how banks are. Which bank issued this? Tennessee Farmers Credit Union, out of Murfreesboro. I'll call them tomorrow, make sure our records match. Perfect? Vernon folded the other papers back into his folder, leaving the loan document on the table. No rush. We've got until end of month. But if we need to sell land to cover it, we should start looking at options. Of course, I said. Vernon kissed my cheek, casual, confident, the kiss of a man who believed his plan was working, and headed to his truck. I waited until his engine started, waited until his truck pulled from the driveway, waited until the diesel sound faded down the road. Then I picked up that loan document and studied every detail. Forged signature, fake date, non-existent loan. I folded it carefully into my jacket pocket, the same pocket holding my father's diagram and the theft calculations, and thought about Vernon's smile when I said I'd double-check my records. He thought I was too stupid to recognize my own signature. 33 years of watching me, sign checks, tax returns, birthday cards, school permission slips. 33 years of seeing my distinctive capital L with its specific loop, and he'd never once paid attention. I folded that document with my forged signature into my jacket pocket, the same pocket where I kept my father's diagram and the calculated theft, and told Vernon I'd look through my files. He smiled at me. Actually smiled because he thought I was too stupid to recognize my own signature. That signature wasn't mine. The capital L was wrong. I've been signing my name the same way for 41 years, and Vernon had never once paid attention. But I knew someone who would pay very close attention to a forged signature on a fraudulent loan document, a lawyer in Nashville who specialized in cases exactly like this. I spread the evidence across Grazia Kendrick's desk in columns: 4 years of theft on the left, Vernon's forged signature in the middle, my father's diagram on the right. I'd found her name through Sandra at Kroger's customer service desk. Sandra's sister had used Grazia Kendrick 3 years ago for a property dispute with her ex-husband. She doesn't mess around, Sandra had said. If you've got a case, she'll fight it. If you don't, she'll tell you straight. Grazia's office sat on the 3rd floor of a brick building in downtown Nashville, surrounded by shelves of legal books and framed certificates. She was 45, I guessed, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She'd looked at my manila folders when I walked in and said, "Show me everything." So I did. Bank statements highlighted in yellow, surveillance photos of Vernon digging at 2 in the morning, the forged loan document, my father's hand-drawn property diagram, Flynn's overlay showing Vernon was 40 feet off target. Grazia read through it all in complete silence. 20 minutes. Maybe longer. I sat across from her desk, hands folded in my lap, watching her face for reactions that never came. Finally, she looked up. "Did you collect all this alone?" she asked. "My son helped with the surveillance. The rest was me." Grazia tapped the forged loan document with her pen. "This signature is forged. I can see it from here. The capital L is wrong. But I'll need a handwriting expert to verify it officially. I can provide samples of my real signature." "Good. We'll need at least 20 examples from different years." Grazia made notes on a legal pad. "The bank statements show systematic theft. The surveillance proves he's searching your property without permission. But we need witnesses. People who saw him digging. People who can testify to the affair, the second family. My neighbor Boyd saw him that first night." "Good. Anyone else?" "I thought about Marlene. about the flash of pain on her face when she mentioned her ex-husband's work travel, about how she'd looked at me like I was nothing without Vernon's shadow. Possibly, I said. How long before he pressures you to sign something? Grazia asked. He set a deadline of November 1st. Claims the loan is due. Grazia looked at the calendar on her desk. Then we have 5 months. There's a particular moment when you realize you're not fighting alone anymore, when you find someone who looks at your evidence and sees a case, not a hysterical wife. Grazia didn't ask if I was sure, didn't suggest marriage counseling or compromise. She looked at my documentation and saw exactly what it was: fraud, theft, systematic planning to steal my inheritance. 5 months to build an airtight case, Grazia continued. We'll need the handwriting analysis, witness statements, property records, showing the land was your father's separate property and went to you specifically. Did your father leave a will? Yes. Everything was left to me, not jointly to Vernon and me. Perfect. Get me a copy. And don't sign anything Vernon gives you. Not loan papers, not property transfers, nothing. If he pressures you, tell him you're waiting for tax documentation or some other delay. Can you do that? Yes. Good. Grazia leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Hargrove, your husband has been planning this for years. The good news is he's documented almost everything himself. The bank transfers, the digging, the forged signature he's handed us, the evidence. We just need to organize it properly. I left Grazia's office 2 hours later with a list of documents to gather and a retainer agreement signed. She'd taken my case. That same week, Flynn drove to 4th Street in Shelbyville. Hartley Lancaster's antique shop sat between a hardware store and a closed diner, its windows dusty and cluttered with old furniture, tarnished silverware, and yellowed books. Flynn had called me from the parking lot. I'm going in, he'd said. I'll pretend I'm browsing, ask about items from the area. Be careful. I will. Flynn's voice came through my phone while I sat in the Kroger parking lot after my shift. Mom, it's real. The treasure is real. He's been selling pieces of it. I gripped the phone tighter. What did you find? Hartley Lancaster keeps meticulous records, ledgers going back 30 years. I asked casually about estate sales, old items from local properties. He mentioned Vernon immediately. What did Vernon sell him? 7 items over the past year, old coins, metal objects, Hartley described as possibly Civil War era. Some papers and protective sleeves. Hartley paid him cash each time between $300 and $800 per item. 7 items, 7 pieces of whatever my father had buried. Did Hartley show you the receipts? I asked. Every single one. Dates, descriptions, amounts. I took photos of the ledger pages. My mind raced through the implications. Vernon had been finding things, not at the X location. He was still digging 40 feet away, but scattered nearby. Pieces my father had buried or left in the general area, which meant the main cache, the one my father marked with an X and the words, "For Leona when needed," was still there, untouched, waiting. Flynn, I said carefully, don't go near the shed's northeast corner. Don't excavate anything yet. I wasn't planning to, but Mom, if he keeps digging, I know. Eventually he'll search 40 feet east and find it. What do we do? We have 5 months before his fake deadline. Grazia says that's enough time. And if he finds it before then? I looked out at the Kroger parking lot, at the familiar cars and shopping carts and fluorescent lights bleeding through the windows. Thought about my father laying that concrete foundation in 1987, marking his diagram, writing, "For Leona when needed." Then we excavate it first, I said. But not yet, not until we have to. I sat in my car in the Kroger parking lot, Flynn's voice still in my ear. 7 items, 7 pieces of whatever my father had buried under that shed in 1987. Vernon had been digging in the wrong spot for months, but he'd been finding scattered pieces nearby enough to know something bigger was there. Enough to keep searching, enough to keep stealing and lying and planning to take everything. And if he kept digging, eventually he'd search 40 feet east and find my father's X. I had 5 months before Vernon's forged deadline, and I needed to make sure he never found that northeast corner. My phone vibrated in my uniform pocket while I was scanning a customer's groceries, and when I saw Thalia's name on the screen, I knew before I answered that she was calling to lie to me. Flynn and I had decided not to excavate my father's X location, yet too risky while Vernon was still digging. Better to let him search in the wrong spot while we built the case. 5 months until Vernon's fake deadline, but I hadn't expected my daughter to call. "Just a moment," I told Mrs. Patterson. I stepped away from register 4, phone vibrating. "Thalia," I answered, walking toward the break room. "Hey, Mom." Her voice was bright, cheerful. "How are you? I feel like we haven't talked in forever." Thalia Hargrove, 32, worked at an insurance office in Murfreesboro. She called maybe once a month, usually Sundays. A Tuesday afternoon call was unusual. "I'm fine, honey, at work right now." "Oh, I'm sorry, I can call back." "It's okay. What's going on?" "Nothing much, just checking in." A pause. "How's Dad?" There it was. "Your father's fine, on a route this week." "Good, good." Another pause. He mentioned something about land paperwork. He seemed worried when I talked to him last. I stood still in the hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead. "Did he?" I said, not a question. "Yeah, something about an old loan. I don't really understand all that stuff, but he said you two need to sort it out soon." My hand tightened on the phone. "Have you known about this long?" I asked softly. Silence. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The kind of silence that stretches and reveals everything. You learn to measure truth not in what your children say, but in the space between the question and the answer. In that pause where they decide which version to tell. In those 2 seconds where Thalia searched for a lie that would sound like truth. "Dad told me last week," she said finally. "When I stopped by the house, he seemed stressed, so I asked what was wrong." "Last week," I repeated. "Yeah. He said something about a deadline, some old paperwork from 2021 you both signed. I told him you two should handle it together." I watched a stock boy push a cart past me. "That's good advice," I said calmly. "I'll talk to your father about it." "Okay, good." Relief in her voice. She thought I believed her. "I just wanted to make sure you knew, didn't want it to be a surprise." "I appreciate that, Thalia." "Love you, Mom." "Love you too, honey." I hung up and stood there, phone warm in my hand. Then I walked back to register 4, apologized to Mrs. Patterson, and continued scanning. Beep, a box of cereal. Beep, a carton of milk. Beep, a bag of apples. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 14 years behind this register. I scanned a box of cereal, beep, and a carton of milk, beep, and a bag of apples, beep, and somewhere in those 3 beeps I understood my daughter had sold me out for whatever Vernon promised her. 2 seconds. That's all it had taken. 2 seconds between my question and Thalia's answer. 2 seconds where my 32-year-old daughter, the child I'd rocked to sleep, the girl I'd driven to soccer practice every Saturday, the woman I'd helped move into her first apartment, searched for the right lie. Dad told me last week. But the forged loan document was dated March 2021. Vernon had been digging since at least March of this year, probably longer. He'd set his November deadline weeks ago. The scheme had been active for months, which meant either Vernon had just told Thalia last week and she was calling to feel out my reaction, or Thalia had known much longer and was calling to apply pressure. That 2-second pause told me everything. If Thalia had truly just learned about it last week, she would have asked questions. "What loan? From 2021, do you remember signing it?" But Thalia hadn't asked questions. She'd made statements. He seemed worried. Something about a deadline. "Some old paperwork from 2021 you both signed." She'd fed me Vernon's version, almost word for word. My shift ended at 6. I clocked out, walked to my car, sat with the engine off. Pulled out my phone and stared at Thalia's name and recent calls. Thought about Flynn, who'd dropped everything to help me. Who'd rented surveillance equipment with his own money. Who'd visited Hartley's antique shop without being asked. Thought about Thalia, who'd called on a Tuesday afternoon to deliver Vernon's message with careful casualness. My daughter had chosen sides, and she'd chosen her father. I started the car, drove home through the June evening, parked beside the shed, where Vernon kept digging in the wrong location. Inside, I pulled out my notebook and added a new entry. June 27th, Tuesday, 3:47 p.m. Thalia called, asked about land paperwork issue. Claims Vernon told her last week. 2-second hesitation before answering suggests otherwise. Feeding Vernon's narrative. Complicit. I set down my pen and looked at that word. Complicit. My daughter. My baby girl. The child I'd carried for 9 months and nursed for a year and loved for 32 years. Complicit in her father's plan to steal my inheritance, defraud me, fund his second family. 2 seconds. That's all it took. 2 seconds between my question and Thalia's answer. 2 seconds where she searched for a lie that would sound like truth. Dad told me last week. But the land scheme had been active for months. The forged document was dated 2021, and Vernon had set his November deadline weeks ago, which meant Thalia hadn't just known she'd been part of the plan from the beginning, and I needed to find out what Vernon had promised her in exchange for betraying her own mother. Flynn called me at work 3 days after Thalia's phone call to say he'd found exactly how much my daughter's silence cost: $1,800. I'd been wondering what Vernon had promised Thalia in exchange for her complicity. A share of the land sale proceeds, a piece of whatever treasure he found, some future inheritance arrangement that cut out Flynn. The answer was simpler, cruder, more insulting. Cash. Mom, Flynn said when I answered my phone during my afternoon break. I found transfers to Thalia, 3 of them. I stood outside the Kroger loading dock watching trucks deliver produce. How much? $1,800 total. I'm coming over tonight to show you. Flynn arrived at 7 with his laptop. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Vernon had presented his forged loan document, and Flynn opened the bank account screen. 3 transfers from our joint account to an account I didn't recognize. Flynn had already confirmed the account number belonged to Thalia. April 15th, 500, Memo Family Support. May 15th, 500, Memo Family Support. June 15th, 800, Memo Family Support. I stared at those entries for a full minute without speaking. Family support. Vernon had paid our daughter $1,800 over 3 months, the same months he'd been escalating his pressure about the forged loan, the same months Thalia had stopped calling regularly, the same time frame when she'd known about his scheme but stayed silent. $1,800, the price of a used car down payment, a modest vacation, 3 months of rent in a cheap apartment. That's what my daughter's loyalty cost. There's a specific mathematics to betrayal. My husband stole $90,000. Over 4 years, my daughter accepted $1,800 over 3 months, and together they thought that was a fair transaction. Mom, Flynn said quietly, what do you want to do? I looked at my son, 27 years old, working overtime as an electrician to help pay for surveillance equipment I couldn't afford, spending his Saturdays monitoring cameras and visiting antique shops and gathering evidence because he believed his mother deserved justice. And I thought about his sister who'd taken $1,800 to help their father steal everything from me. I didn't tell Thalia about this, I said calmly. Don't tell her we know. Flynn nodded, understanding immediately. We weren't confronting anyone yet. We were documenting everything. Building the case, Grazia said, would take 5 months. Every piece of evidence, every lie, every payment, all of it filed away for the moment when I'd need it. Days later, I overheard Vernon on the phone with Marlene. I was in the hallway putting away laundry when I heard his voice from the kitchen, low and tense. Then Marlene's voice came through the phone speaker, sharp and loud enough for me to hear clearly. Are you having a child with someone else? I stopped moving, stood perfectly still with a stack of towels in my hands. What, no? Who told you that? Vernon's voice was defensive, surprised. Doesn't matter who told me. Are you? Marlene, that's ridiculous. It's neighborhood gossip. You know how people talk. I know how you travel for work, Vernon. I know about the Texas routes and the overnight stays and the money that seems to disappear from your account. Someone had been talking. I wondered who. Boyd, one of Hartley's customers. Someone in Clarksville who'd seen Vernon's truck at Cressida's house. There's nothing to know, Vernon said firmly. I work, I come home, that's it. Then swear it to me, Marlene demanded. Swear on our mother's grave there's no other woman and no child. I held my breath in the hallway. I swear, Marlene, Vernon said without hesitation. There's no other woman, no child. People talk, they make things up. You know how small towns are. You swear it. I swear. On Mom's grave, on everything, there's nothing. I stood in that hallway listening to Vernon swear to his sister, and I thought about Marlene at my kitchen table 3 months ago, saying I was lucky to have him, and I smiled for the first time since Boyd knocked on my door. Vernon had just created a witness. When Marlene eventually learned about Cressida, and she would, because I'd make certain of it, she would remember this exact conversation, this oath, this false swearing on their mother's grave. Marlene, who'd been betrayed by her own traveling husband 12 years ago. Marlene, who'd shown that flash of old pain when she mentioned her ex-husband's work trips. Marlene, who would recognize the pattern because she'd lived through it herself. Vernon was handing me witnesses without even realizing it. "Fine," Marlene said finally, her voice still suspicious. "But if I find out you're lying to me, Vernon—" "You won't, because I'm not." They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Marlene's garden, Vernon's upcoming route, whether he'd heard from our brother lately. Normal sibling conversation. Then Vernon hung up and walked past me into the living room, completely unaware I'd heard every word. "Everything okay with Marlene?" I asked, folding a towel. "Yeah, fine. She just wanted to check in." "That's nice of her." Vernon settled into his recliner, picked up the TV remote. People in this town talk too much. She heard some nonsense and wanted to make sure everything was fine. "What kind of nonsense?" "Nothing important. You know how rumors spread." I nodded and carried the towels upstairs to the linen closet. Inside my bedroom, I pulled out my notebook and added a new entry. July 18th. Vernon received call from Marlene. She'd heard rumors about another woman and a child. Vernon denied everything, swore on their mother's grave, no other woman, no child. Marlene accepted the denial but sounded suspicious. Potential witness when truth emerges. I put that oath away in my mind, the same place I kept everything else, the stolen funds, the forged signature, the $1,800 to Thalia, the 11 failed digs, the 7 sold treasures, the 4-year-old boy in Clarksville, who looked exactly like Vernon. Every lie, every deception, every false oath, all of it waiting for the moment when I'd lay it out in front of a judge and watch Vernon's entire fabricated world collapse. And when Marlene eventually saw Hugo with her own eyes, that oath would become the nail in Vernon's coffin. Grazia called me at the end of July to say she'd found the surveyor whose name Vernon had used illegally, and he was willing to testify. The pieces were falling into place faster now. Marlene's false oath from Vernon, the $1,800 to Thalia, Flynn's surveillance footage, Hartley's receipts for the 7 sold items, and now this, a professional surveyor who could stand in front of a judge and say my signature had been forged. Forrest Kingsley arrived at Grazia's Nashville office on a Thursday afternoon. 52 years old, weathered face, from years working outdoors, wearing work boots and a button-down shirt, he'd clearly pressed for the occasion. He shook my hand carefully, apologetically. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I'm sorry for any trouble this has caused." Grazia gestured for us to sit. She'd already laid out the 2022 land survey contract on her desk, the one Vernon had commissioned without my knowledge, the one with my forged signature authorizing the work. "Mr. Kingsley," Grazia began, "walk us through what happened with this contract." Forrest pulled reading glasses from his shirt pocket. "Vernon Hargrove contacted me in March 2022, said he and his wife needed a property survey for estate planning purposes. He showed me this contract, said Mrs. Hargrove had already signed her consent." I sat very still listening. "I thought this was your signature, Mrs. Hargrove." Forrest continued, pointing to the line at the bottom of the contract. "Vernon was professional, had all the paperwork ready. I had no reason to question it." Grazia reached into a folder and pulled out 20 examples of my real signature checks I'd signed over the past decade, tax returns, the deed to my father's land from 2010. She laid them beside the contract signature. "Compare these two," Grazia said calmly. "Same person." Forrest studied the signatures for maybe 30 seconds. Then he looked up at me and I saw the moment he understood. "No," he said quietly. "The L is wrong. Your real signature has a distinctive loop here." He pointed to my actual signatures. "This one doesn't. The H is different too. The slant is close, but the pressure points are off. I want you to understand what it means to watch a professional point to your forged signature and say the words, 'This is fraud,' out loud in a room with your lawyer taking notes. It means evidence. It means witnesses. It means Vernon's careful planning, unraveling one thread at a time." "This one's forged," Forrest said, setting down his glasses. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't know. If I had, I never would have completed that survey." "We know you didn't," Grazia said. "That's why we need you to testify to exactly this. What you just explained, the differences in the signatures, how Vernon presented the contract as legitimate, your professional opinion that this signature was forged. Forrest nodded immediately. I'll testify, whatever you need. We spent another hour going through details. Grazia recorded Forrest's statement, had him sign an affidavit, scheduled him for a deposition. By the time he left, we had another witness for the case file. Before I tell you what we found buried under that concrete at 2 a.m, are you still with me? Comment A if you think my father left treasure, or B if you think it was just documents, and add one short reason why. Quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details to convey the emotional impact. The lesson is what matters. Flynn and I waited until 2 a.m. on a moonless night. Vernon was in Texas, actually Texas this time or so, he claimed. The neighborhood was silent, every house dark. We worked by flashlight at the shed's northeast corner foundation, exactly where my father's diagram had marked the X, 40 feet from where Vernon had been digging for months. Flynn had brought a manual auger from a job site, the kind that drills quietly, no power tools to wake the neighbors. He started at the corner where the concrete met the dirt, drilling down through the foundation my father had poured in 1987. 1 foot, Flynn whispered. 2 feet, 3. I held the flashlight steady, watching dirt come up with each turn of the auger. 4 feet, 4.5. Metal scraped against metal. Flynn stopped, looked at me. I hit something. We widened the hole by hand, pulling dirt away carefully. The flashlight beam caught the edge of something dark and metallic. Flynn's flashlight beam caught the edge of that metal container, and I thought about my father pouring this concrete foundation 30 years ago, burying something he knew I'd need someday, marking it for Leona when needed. We worked carefully, clearing dirt from around the edges. A sealed metal container about the size of a small suitcase. My father's handwriting was barely visible on the lid, faded but still legible. LW 1993. Leona Whitfield. My maiden name, before I became Leona Hargrove. That's it, I whispered. That's what Dad buried. Flynn started to lift it out. Wait, I said. He looked at me. Close it up, I said. Fill it. Pour new concrete. Plant grass seed. No one can know we found it, not yet. Mom, Vernon's been searching for 4 months and hasn't found it. We have 3 months until his fake deadline. We don't excavate this until we're ready to use it in court. Flynn understood. We filled that hole by 3 a.m., poured fresh concrete over it, scattered the excess dirt across the property in the dark. By dawn, the ground looked untouched, just the shed's northeast corner where it had always been, where my father had built it in 1993 with his own hands. Vernon was 40 feet away and 4 months of digging away from ever finding it. But I'd found it in one night with a diagram and a flashlight, and now I had what Vernon wanted most, and he would never know until I decided to tell him. First, though, I needed to know exactly what my father had left for me in that sealed metal box. I waited until Vernon left for his Thursday route before I carried the metal container from the shed to my storage room and opened it alone. Flynn had wanted to be there, but I'd asked him to wait. Whatever my father had buried in 1993, I needed to see it first by myself. The container sat on the storage room floor under the single yellow bulb. The seal broke with a soft crack. Inside, organized in careful stacks, U.S. government bonds, Series EE, dated 1985-1995. 12 bonds, $1,000 each. Matured bonds worth double or triple their face value now. Stock certificates for 2 Shelbyville companies, 1 construction firm, 1 manufacturing plant, both still operating, both worth considerably more than when my father purchased them. And at the bottom, a manila envelope labeled Property Deeds. I opened it. Inside, ownership certificates for 15 acres adjacent to my 80 acres. Land my father had purchased in 1993 under a different deed structure. Land that wasn't listed in his estate documents. Land I hadn't known existed. I did rough calculations. The bonds, $30,000 to $40,000. The stocks, $60,000 to $80,000. The 15 acres, at least $120,000 at current prices. My father had buried roughly $300,000, and Vernon had been digging 40 feet away for months. At the very bottom, a sealed white envelope for Leona. I opened it with shaking hands. 2 pages in my father's careful print. Leona, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you need it. I know you'll use it properly. I buried this in 1993 when you were 29 and newly married to Vernon. I had doubts about that man even then, but you loved him and I kept quiet. This land has been in our family since 1944. Your grandfather bought it with railroad money. I've added to it over the years, bought the 15 acres in 93 when the Fletcher property came up. Never told anyone, kept it separate. I fear after I'm gone there will be fighting. Your brother will want his share. Lawyers will get involved. I've seen it happen to families. I want you to have this Leona. Not because you're my favorite, though you probably are, but because you were the one who sat with me on the porch and talked about this land like it mattered. You understood protecting it for the next generation. If you're reading this, you need it. Use it to protect yourself. Use it to protect this land. Your loving father, Thomas Whitfield. I sat on that storage room floor with my father's letter in both hands and cried for the first time since Boyd knocked on my door, not from grief or anger, but because my father had known somehow that I would need this. He'd buried it 30 years ago, marked it for me, and trusted I'd find it when the time was right. I called Flynn, showed him everything. $300,000, he said quietly. Give or take. And Dad has no idea. None. What do we do with it? We document everything. Tell Grazia. Make it part of the case. I folded my father's letter. This proves the land and assets were mine separately, not marital property. Vernon has no claim. 3 weeks later, Marlene called. Her voice was different. No superiority, no condescension, just flat tired. Can we meet? She asked. There's a cafe on Fletcher Street, tomorrow afternoon. I arrived at 2. Marlene was already there, coffee untouched. She looked older, or maybe just more honest. I saw Vernon last week, she said without preamble. At the gas station on 40th Street. He had a woman with him, and a child, a boy about 4. Brown hair, Vernon's eyes, Vernon's smile. I sipped my coffee waiting. My ex-husband did the same thing to me. Marlene continued, voice flat. 12 years of marriage. Then I found out about the other woman, the other family. I know that look men have when they're living 2 lives. I saw it on Vernon's face. There's a specific kind of alliance that forms between women who've been betrayed, the same way it doesn't need apologies or explanations, just recognition. What do you need from me? Marlene asked. A witness, I said simply, that you saw Hugo and recognized him as Vernon's child. Hugo, that's the boy's name. Yes. Marlene nodded. I'll testify, whatever you need. We sat in silence. Then Marlene added almost as an afterthought. Vernon told me you agreed to sign the land sale papers. He said it was all settled, you were fine with it. I set down my coffee cup carefully. I haven't signed anything, Marlene, I said, and I'm not going to. She looked at me understanding, flooding her face. Vernon had lied to his own sister about me the same way he'd sworn a false oath to her about Hugo. She'd believed him both times because he was her brother. Now she knew exactly what kind of man he really was. Marlene looked at me across that cafe table and said, Vernon told me you agreed to sign. He said it was all settled. You were fine with it. I set down my coffee cup and met her eyes. I haven't signed anything, Marlene, and I'm not going to. She nodded slowly, understanding flooding her face. Vernon had lied to his own sister about me, the same way he'd sworn a false oath to her about Hugo. She'd believed him both times because he was her brother, and now she knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The question was whether she'd be willing to stand up in court and say so. Flynn walked back into Hartley Lancaster's antique shop in mid-August this time, without the pretense, and told him the truth about Vernon. Marlene had answered my question in the cafe parking lot before she drove away. I'll testify, she'd said. Whatever you need. I'll stand up in court and say what I saw. So that was settled. Now we needed Hartley. Flynn called me from the antique shop an hour later. Hartley's cooperating. He's calling Grazia now. I met them both at Grazia's office 2 days later. Hartley brought his ledgers, the same meticulous records Flynn had photographed weeks ago now being handed over officially. Hartley looked uncomfortable, guilty. Mrs. Hargrove, I had no idea those items were taken without your consent. Vernon presented himself as a legitimate seller. I keep all my acquisition records precisely because I never want to handle stolen goods. I know you didn't know, I said. That's why we need your testimony about what Vernon told you when he sold them. Grazia spread Hartley's ledger across her desk. 7 transactions over 14 months from May 2022 through July 2023. Each one carefully documented with date, item description, amount paid, and notes about the seller. May 2022 metal box weathered possible Civil War era, $350. June 2022 coins mixed dates 1880s, 1920s, $400. August 2022 silver coin 1891 engraving mint condition, $800. Grazia stopped at that entry, tapped it with her pen. This one, she said, an 1891 silver coin, mint condition. That's not something someone casually finds in their backyard. Vernon said it was from his wife's family estate, Hartley explained. Said they were cleaning out old storage, selling off items they didn't need. Grazia looked at me. Did your father collect coins? I don't know, I admitted. He never mentioned it, but he buried that container in 1987. There could have been coins in there, alongside the bonds and deeds. This proves theft from property, Grazia said, making notes. Not just civil fraud, but criminal conversion of assets. Vernon excavated items from your land, sold them for personal gain without your knowledge or consent. Total amount from the 7 sales, $3,400. Not a fortune, but evidence. Proof that Vernon had been systematically stealing from my property and selling what he found while searching for the main cash. I want you to understand what it means to watch a question just 2 words. Which bank destroys someone's entire plan because they never prepared for you to ask it? Vernon came home on a Thursday in early September. I was making dinner when he walked in, and I could tell immediately something was different. His movements were tighter, more controlled, desperate. He set his bag down and pulled papers from his jacket, the same forged loan document he'd shown me in May. "We need to talk about this," he said, placing the papers on the kitchen table. His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was pressured, urgent. "The deadline is November 1st. You need to sign so we can sell the North 40 acres and pay off the debt before the bank seizes everything." I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked to the table, looked down at the familiar forgery. "Which bank?" I asked. Vernon stopped moving, just for a second. 1 full second of silence. "What? Which bank issued this loan? You said Tennessee Farmers Credit Union before, but I don't see their letterhead on the agreement, just a blank form." Vernon's jaw tightened. "It's a standard loan form. The bank has the original on file." "I see." I kept my voice calm, casual. "Well, I'll need to check with my lawyer before I sign anything this substantial." Vernon's expression changed, froze really like he'd been struck. "Your lawyer?" "Yes, Grazia Kendrick, out of Nashville. She handles property law." Vernon sat down slowly in the chair across from me. "You hired a lawyer?" "Yes." "When?" I met his eyes. "In June." Vernon sat there with those papers in his hands, and I watched him do the mathematics. I'd hired Grazia in June. It was now September, which meant I'd been building a case for 3 months, while he thought I was scanning groceries and suspecting nothing. Since June, he repeated like he was trying to process a foreign language. Since June. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You never asked." Vernon stared at the papers, then at me, then back at the papers. I could see him recalculating everything, every conversation we'd had since spring, every time he'd mentioned the land, every assumption he'd made about what I knew. "What did you hire a lawyer for?" he asked carefully. "Estate planning, property documentation, making sure everything with my father's land is properly recorded." "All true, just not complete." "And you've been meeting with her since June?" "Regularly." Vernon's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, suspicion, calculation, and finally something I'd never seen before in 33 years of marriage: fear. "I need you to sign this before November 1st, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "I'll have Grazia review it first. She'll want to verify the loan with the bank, make sure everything's legitimate." "It's legitimate? Then there's no problem with my lawyer verifying it." I smiled. "You understand, Vernon, it's a lot of money, a lot of land. I want to make sure we're doing everything properly." Vernon gathered his papers, stood up, walked to the bedroom without another word. I finished making dinner, set the table. Called him when it was ready. We ate in silence. Vernon looked at me across that table, papers still in his hands, and said, "Since June," like he was trying to make sense of a foreign language. I nodded. Since June. I watched him calculate June was when I'd met Grazia, which was after I'd found the forged signature in May, which was after Flynn's surveillance in April, which was after Boyd knocked on my door in March. 6 months. I'd been methodically building a case against him for 6 months, and he was just now realizing he'd underestimated the woman behind the Kroger counter. The question was whether he'd give up or double down, and I already knew Vernon well enough to know the answer. Grazia called me into her Nashville office the 3rd week of September and spread the complete case file across her desk in 4 neat columns, each one representing a different category of Vernon's fraud. Vernon had doubled down just like I knew he would. After learning about my lawyer, he'd tried harder, calling me twice daily about the urgent deadline showing up at Kroger during my shifts, leaving notes on the kitchen counter about protecting our family's future, each attempt more desperate than the last. But Grazia had been ready. 4 categories, she said, gesturing to the organized stacks of documents. Column 1, forged signatures. 3 separate instances, each verified by a handwriting expert Grazia had hired. The loan document, the survey contract, a property transfer form I'd never seen before. Each one with my name signed in Vernon's approximation of my handwriting, each one missing the distinctive loop in my capital L. Column 2, financial theft. Bank statements going back 4 years. Highlighted transfers totaling over $90,000. The $1,800 to Thalia. The systematic bleeding of our joint account to fund Cressida and Hugo. Column 3, unauthorized contracts. The survey agreement with Forrest Kingsley's signature executed under false pretenses using my forged consent. Land use documents I'd never approved. Estate planning papers I'd never seen. Column 4, conversion of assets. Hartley Lancaster's meticulous ledger. 7 sales, $3,400 items excavated from my property without permission. The 1891 silver coin that proved Vernon had been stealing from the land itself. 5 witnesses prepared to testify. Grazia continued tapping a separate folder. Forrest Kingsley confirms the forged signature on the survey contract. Hartley Lancaster documents the unauthorized sales. Marlene Hargrove saw Hugo and can identify him as Vernon's son. Boyd Hampton witnessed the nighttime digging in March, and Flynn has surveillance footage of 11 separate excavation attempts. I want you to understand what it looks like when 6 months of quiet work becomes 4 columns of irrefutable evidence spread across a lawyer's desk. It looks like justice. It looks like preparation. It looks like the careful documentation of every lie a man told while he thought his wife was too simple to notice. "This is airtight," Grazia said. "Every angle of Vernon's fraud is documented and provable." I stared at those 4 columns thinking about Boyd's knock in March. 6 months ago. Half a year of gathering evidence while Vernon dug holes and forged signatures and promised Cressida a future built on my inheritance. "Now you need to choose," Grazia said. "Civil or criminal?" I looked up. "What's the difference?" "Civil means divorce, property division, financial restitution. You get your land, your money, your freedom. Vernon faces no criminal charges, just loses everything in the settlement." "And criminal?" "Criminal means fraud charges, forgery, theft, conversion of assets. He could face 5 to 10 years in prison." I thought about that for a long moment. Thought about Vernon in an orange jumpsuit sitting in a cell losing years of his life. Thought about Hugo, 4 years old, brown hair and Vernon's smile, an innocent child who didn't choose any of this. "Civil," I said. "I want my land and my honor. That little boy doesn't deserve to lose his father to prison." Grazia nodded. "I thought you'd say that. Does that make me weak?" "No, it makes you better than Vernon." We spent the next 2 hours going through logistics, filing deadlines, court dates, witness preparation. Grazia would file the civil suit next week, serve Vernon with papers, and schedule the hearing for October. "He'll try to settle," Grazia predicted. "Once he sees the evidence, he'll want to avoid court. And if he doesn't, then we go to court and present these 4 columns to a judge, and Vernon loses everything." I left Grazia's office at 4, drove back to Shelbyville, worked my evening shift at Kroger, scanned groceries, bagged items, smiled at customers. Normal. Ordinary. The woman behind register 4 doing her job like she'd done for 14 years. Nobody knew that in my car I had copies of 4 columns of evidence that would destroy my husband's entire fabricated life. 3 days later, Grazia called me with news I hadn't expected. "Cressida Ashford just contacted me," she said. "What?" "She doesn't know about the lawsuit. She found my name and number in Vernon's phone contacts, thought I was his lawyer. She's worried about him." I sat down at my kitchen table. "What did she say?" "She said Vernon's been acting strange. Stressed, unstable, drinking more than usual. She's concerned for Hugo's safety around him. She wanted to know if there were legal issues she should be aware of." "Did you tell her?" "No. I took notes, thanked her for calling, said I'd be in touch. But Leona, she said something important." I waited. Grazia read me that line from her notes, "The land will be ours." And I sat back in my chair thinking about 2021 when I was still making Vernon breakfast every morning and Hugo was learning to walk in Clarksville. She said Vernon promised her back in 2021, quote, "The land will be ours. Once I get the land, we'll be set. Can you confirm what year is the forged debt document supposedly from 2021, March 2021? But we know it's actually forged in 2024, probably this spring, which means he'd been planning this for 3 years. I finished quietly. Since Hugo was 1 year old. Exactly. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was calculated, premeditated theft. He promised Cressida your land in 2021, then spent 3 years figuring out how to steal it. I looked out my kitchen window at the shed where Vernon had dug 11 holes. At the land my father had left me. At the home I'd lived in for 33 years. Vernon had sat at this table in 2021, kissed me goodnight, acted like everything was normal, and the whole time he'd been planning how to take my father's land and give it to Cressida. Grazia set down her phone and looked at me across those 4 columns of evidence. The land will be ours. 2021. 3 years before the debt document he claims is from 2021, but we know is forged from 2024. This proves he's been planning to steal your inheritance since Hugo was 1 year old. I thought about Vernon at our kitchen table in 2021, asking me how my day was, kissing my forehead, acting like everything was normal while he was already planning how to take my father's land and give it to Cressida. The hearing was set for October, and Cressida had just handed us the final piece we needed to destroy Vernon's entire defense. 3 days before the October hearing, I drove to Thalia's house in Murfreesboro with a manila folder on the passenger seat and nothing left to lose. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday. Grazia had the evidence organized. The witnesses prepared the case built so tightly there was no room for Vernon to slip through. But there was one thing I needed to do first. I needed to look my daughter in the eye and show her what her silence had cost. Thalia's apartment complex was neat, modern, the kind of place a 32-year-old insurance analyst could afford on her own. I'd helped her move in 4 years ago, carrying boxes up 2 flights of stairs, arranging furniture, proud of her independence. Now I stood at her door holding proof that she'd sold that independence for $1,800. She answered on the second knock wearing yoga pants and a sweatshirt, clearly not expecting company. Her expression shifted from surprise to something guarded when she saw my face. "Mom, what are you—" I walked past her without speaking into the familiar living room where I'd sat a dozen times drinking tea and making small talk. The folder felt heavy in my hands. Thalia closed the door slowly. "Is everything okay?" I set the folder on her kitchen table. Didn't sit down, just stood there waiting. "What's this?" she asked. I remembered Thalia at 7 years old, standing at my bedroom door during a thunderstorm, asking in a small voice, "Mama, will you always protect me?" I'd pulled back the covers, let her climb into bed beside me, held her until the thunder passed. "Always." I'd promised. "I'll always protect you." The memory cut deeper than any legal document ever could. "Open it," I said. Thalia approached the table slowly, like she already knew what was inside. She opened the folder. 3 bank statements. 3 highlighted transactions. April 15th, $500. May 15th, $500. June 15th, $800. Her face went pale. You knew what he was doing, I said quietly. You helped him erase me. These receipts prove it. Mom, I can explain. Can you explain how you took money from your father to stay quiet while he forged my signature? While he stole from our joint account? While he built a second family with another woman? Thalia's hands shook on the folder. He told me you'd agreed to everything. He said the land sale was mutual, that you'd signed the papers but were having second thoughts. He said the money was to help me with rent because times were tight. And you believed him. He's my father. And I'm your mother. Silence filled the kitchen. Outside, someone's car alarm chirped. Inside, my daughter stood there holding evidence of her own complicity, and I realized she'd made her choice months ago. The hearing is Thursday, I said. You're welcome to attend. See what your $1,800 paid for. I left the folder on her table and walked out. Didn't slam the door, didn't say goodbye, just left the silence between us heavier than any argument could have been. Thursday morning, the Nashville Civil Courthouse looked smaller than I'd imagined. Not the grand marble building from movies, but a practical brick structure with American flags flanking the entrance. Grazia met me in the lobby at 8:30. Ready, as I'll ever be. The courtroom was functional fluorescent lights, worn wooden benches, a judge's bench that had seen decades of disputes. Grazia and I sat at the plaintiff's table organizing documents while we waited. Vernon entered at 8:45 with his lawyer, a man in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Vernon wore his best shirt, the one he saved for weddings and funerals. His eyes scanned the room but skipped over me like I was furniture. Judge Whitmore entered at 9. We all stood. Please be seated. Case number 2023 CV 4829, Hargrove versus Hargrove. Counsel, your opening statements. Vernon's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this is a straightforward marital property dispute. Mrs. Hargrove consented to her husband managing household finances for 33 years. The documents in question were signed with full knowledge and consent. This is buyer's remorse, not fraud. Grazia rose with calm precision. Your Honor will prove 3 irrefutable points. Point 1. Bank signature analysis confirms Vernon Hargrove forged his wife's signature on multiple legal documents. Point 2. Text messages between Mr. Hargrove and Cressida Ashford explicitly discuss concealing assets and keeping mother out of it. Point 3. The property deed transfer to Mr. Hargrove's name alone directly contradicts any claim of mutual marital consent. She laid each piece of evidence on the table as she spoke. The signature analysis, the text message screenshots, the deed transfer. Point 1, point 2, point 3, each word a nail, each receipt a coffin lid, each date a door slamming shut on his lies. The courtroom sounds faded, the shuffling papers, the judge's pen scratching, and all I heard was the precision of justice being built brick by brick. Vernon's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we request a brief postponement to gather counter evidence and expert witnesses. Denied, Judge Whitmore said, still reviewing the documents. The evidence is clear and timely. We'll proceed. That's when Vernon looked at me. Not with hatred, not with defiance, but with something that looked like fear or perhaps regret. His eyes widened slightly as if he was seeing me, truly seeing me for the first time in 33 years. And I realized with a cold shock he'd never thought I would actually fight back. Never thought the woman behind the Kroger counter could build a case like this. Never thought I was capable of cornering him in a courtroom with 5 witnesses and 4 columns of evidence. He'd underestimated me completely. I'd wanted his fear, worked for months to build this case, sacrificed sleep and sanity to corner him here. But now witnessing it, the victory felt strangely hollow. Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess. I sat back in the hard wooden chair, Vernon's frightened eyes still burned into my memory, and wondered if justice would heal anything or just conclude it. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. All rise, court is now in session. The recess had lasted 15 minutes. I'd spent it in the hallway with Flynn, drinking water from a fountain, not speaking. Vernon had stayed inside the courtroom with Douglas Crane, his lawyer, probably strategizing a defense that didn't exist. Now we filed back in. Judge Whitmore, a silver-haired woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, settled into her seat and reviewed her notes. "We'll proceed with witness testimony," she said. "Ms. Kendrick." Grazia called Forrest Kingsley first. Forrest took the stand sworn in, stated his occupation licensed surveyor, 28 years experience. Grazia showed him the 2022 survey contract. "Mr. Kingsley, is this your signature?" "Yes, ma'am." "And this signature here, purporting to be Leona Hargrove's consent, is it authentic?" Forrest looked at me, then at the document. "No, ma'am. That's not her signature. I've seen Mrs. Hargrove's real signature on prior contracts. The capital L is wrong. The loop in the H is missing. This is a forgery." Vernon shifted in his seat. Grazia called Hartley Lancaster next. Hartley brought his ledger, showed the 7 transactions, described each item Vernon had sold. Coins, metal objects, a silver piece from 1891. "Did Mr. Hargrove have documentation proving ownership?" "No, ma'am. He said they were from family storage. I had no reason to doubt him at the time." Boyd Hampton followed. 58 years old, garage owner, neighbor for 12 years. He described the night in March when he'd seen flashlight beams behind my shed. "I saw him digging past midnight with equipment," Boyd said. "Seemed strange for residential property. That's when I decided to tell Leona." Then Marlene Hargrove took the stand. Vernon's own sister, 56 years old, wearing a navy dress, hands folded in her lap. "Ms. Hargrove, what did you observe on the morning of August 12th? "I saw my brother at the gas station on 40th Street. Marlene said, her voice steady. "He was with a woman and a child, a boy about 4 years old. Brown hair, Vernon's eyes." "Did you speak to your brother?" "No. I called him later that day, asked him directly if he had a child with another woman." "What did he say?" "He swore to me on our mother's grave that there was no other woman, no child. He said people were spreading rumors." Marlene looked at Vernon then. He stared at her, but she refused to meet his eyes. "He lied to me," she said quietly. When Marlene stepped down, Vernon watched her walk past his table. She kept her eyes forward, her face composed. The sister who'd believed him for 56 years, who'd told me I was lucky to have him, who'd defended him without question, she didn't look at him once. Grazia called me last. I walked to the witness stand on steady legs, raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth. Grazia asked me to recount the timeline. I did methodically, without emotion. March 14th. Boyd Hampton knocked on my door and told me what he'd seen. April, my son Flynn installed surveillance cameras. May, I found the forged loan document Vernon had hidden. June, I hired attorney Grazia Kendrick. July, we located the items my father had buried in 1993. August, witnesses came forward, Marlene Hargrove, Hartley Lancaster. September, we compiled the complete evidence file. I didn't cry on that stand. I'd cried enough in March and April in all those months alone with my notebooks and receipts. This was just facts now, dates and documents and the systematic unraveling of 33 years of marriage. Douglas Crane stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Hargrove, did you conduct this investigation entirely alone?" I looked at Flynn sitting in the front row behind Grazia's table. "No," I said. "I didn't do it alone." "So you had help building this case against your husband?" "I had help discovering the truth about what my husband had been doing to me." Douglas Crane sat down. Judge Whitmore reviewed the evidence for what felt like hours but was probably 15 minutes. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of her pen on paper pages, turning the quiet rustle of documents. Finally, she looked up. "I've reviewed the testimonies, the documentary evidence, and the expert analysis. This court finds as follows." She read from her notes, her voice measured and clear. "The 80 acres in question plus the 15 adjacent acres documented in the property deeds are Mrs. Hargrove's separate property, inherited from her father, Thomas Whitfield. These are not marital assets, subject to division." Vernon's hands gripped the table edge. "The debt document dated March 2021 is invalid. The signature has been proven fraudulent by expert analysis. This court finds that Mr. Hargrove forged his wife's signature with intent to defraud." Judge Whitmore continued. "Mr. Hargrove is ordered to repay $90,000 plus accrued interest representing funds improperly taken from the joint marital account between 2019 and 2023. She paused, looked directly at Vernon. Furthermore, this case will be transferred to the prosecutor's office for consideration of criminal charges related to forgery, fraud, and theft. You think justice feels like triumph, like fireworks and vindication. It doesn't. It feels like closing a book you never wanted to read. It feels like standing in the ruins of your life and being told officially that yes, it really did burn down and here's the paperwork to prove it. Judge Whitmore concluded, regarding the divorce petition, the marriage is dissolved. Mrs. Hargrove retains full ownership of the family home, the 80 acres, and the 15 adjacent acres. Mr. Hargrove has no claim to any property that was Mrs. Hargrove's separate inheritance. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Grazia turned to me, nodded once. I nodded back. That was all that was needed. The room began to empty. I saw Thalia slip out the back door without a glance at her father. She'd been there the whole time, sitting in the last row, and I hadn't even noticed. Vernon sat alone at his table. Douglas Crane packing files in the silence. Marlene walked out without looking back. Flynn waited for me by the door. Even his own family had walked away. As the judge's gavel fell and the room began to empty, I saw Thalia slip out the back door without a glance at her father. Vernon sat alone at his table, his lawyer packing files in silence. Even his own family had walked away. The legal battle was over, but the real question remained: what comes after justice? Victory, I learned, doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. Grazia called on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Judge Whitmore signed the final order. I was standing in my father's study, sorting through documents I could finally reclaim as my own. The sunlight fell across his old desk in golden stripes, warming the wood he'd touched 1,000 times. Leona, I thought you should know, Grazia said without preamble. Cressida Ashford left the state 3 days ago, took Hugo with her, no forwarding address. I set down the stack of property deeds I'd been holding. Vernon. She didn't tell him. He showed up at the Clarksville rental yesterday and found it empty. Neighbors said they saw her loading a sedan at dawn. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt the weight of something I couldn't name. The boy's only 4, I said quietly. Yes, Grazia's voice softened. I know. Hugo hadn't chosen his parents, hadn't asked to be born into Vernon's web of lies. Now he was somewhere on a highway heading toward a future rewritten by adult failures, and I, who'd fought so hard for justice, couldn't protect him from that. Thank you for telling me, I said. After we hung up, I stood at the window looking out at the 80 acres Vernon had tried to steal. The land rolled green and eternal under October clouds. My father had left it to me, and I'd kept it. But the victory tasted like ash. Justice is a house you build brick by brick, only to discover you're standing in it alone. The days turned colder. I threw myself into practical matters, meeting with accountants, restructuring finances, changing locks Vernon's keys had once opened. Flynn helped me install motion sensor lights along the property line. Marlene brought casseroles I barely touched. 2 weeks after the verdict, on a Thursday afternoon gray with approaching rain, someone knocked. I wasn't expecting visitors. When I opened the door, Thalia stood on my porch holding nothing. No purse, no umbrella, no excuse. We stared at each other. She looked older than I remembered. Her hair, always so carefully styled, hung loose around her shoulders. The fine lines around her mouth seemed deeper. May I come in? She asked. I stepped aside. She walked past me into the living room and stood there, hands clasped, looking at the photographs on the mantel, pictures of my father, of this land, before Vernon tried to carve it up and sell it. I didn't know, Thalia said finally, about the forgery, about any of it. I wanted to ask how she could have been so blind, how she could have stood in that courtroom and defended him, but the words wouldn't come. I believed him. She continued, voice barely above a whisper. For 36 years, I believed everything he told me. I thought that made me loyal. It just made me a fool. She turned to face me. Her eyes were red but dry, as though she'd cried herself empty days ago. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said. I just wanted you to know. I nodded slowly. What else could I do? Would you like some tea? I heard myself ask. Thalia blinked, surprised. Then quietly, yes, thank you. I made chamomile, the kind my father used to drink on difficult evenings. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd studied those bank statements months ago, where this entire nightmare had first taken shape. The tea grew cold between us, but neither of us moved to warm it. Some silences are too fragile to break. We sat for nearly an hour. Thalia traced the rim of her cup with one finger. I watched the rain begin to fall outside, soft and steady, soaking into soil Vernon had tried to steal. Finally, Thalia stood. I should go. I walked her to the door. She paused on the threshold, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single brass key. She set it gently on the entry table. "That's my house key," she said. "The one your father gave me 20 years ago when he said family should always have a way in." I stared at the key, gleaming dull gold in the gray afternoon light. "I don't deserve to keep it," Thalia continued, "but if you ever want to give it back to me, I'll try to earn it." She walked to her car without looking back. I stood in the doorway watching her taillights disappear down the long gravel drive, the key resting cold and heavy on the table beside me. Trust, I realized, isn't something you lose all at once, and it isn't something you rebuild with words. It's a key left behind, a silence shared, a cup of tea grown cold. It's the choice to begin again knowing you might fail. I picked up the key and held it in my palm, feeling its weight. Outside, the rain fell on my father's land, my land now washing everything clean, preparing the soil for whatever might grow next. The question was, would I let anything grow, or would I stand alone in my house of justice, victorious and empty? I didn't have an answer yet, but I put the key in my pocket instead of throwing it away. That, I thought, was something. Boyd's truck pulled into my driveway on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet arrival that carries news without ceremony. I was in the kitchen when I heard the gravel crunch under his tires. Through the window, I watched him climb down from the cab, same slow, deliberate movements I'd seen that March night when he'd knocked to tell me about the dig sites. A lifetime ago. 4 months, that felt like decades. I met him at the door. "Coffee?" I asked. "Appreciate it," he said. We settled on the porch, 2 mugs steaming between us. The November air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke from someone's chimney down the valley. Boyd wrapped his hands around the mug, warming them. "Saw Vernon's truck leave early Saturday," he said finally. "Boxes piled in the back. Didn't say goodbye to nobody." I nodded slowly, watching the steam rise from my coffee. I'd expected this news, or something like it. Vernon had nothing left here. Cressida was gone. Hugo was gone. Thalia had walked away. The land was legally, irrevocably mine. The court had stripped him of everything he'd tried to steal, and most of what he'd thought he owned. What surprised me was what I felt relief. Not triumph, not vindication, not even satisfaction. Just the quiet exhale of a chapter finally closing, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what my shoulders felt like without it. "Thank you, Boyd," I said, "for knocking that night. You started all this." He shook his head. "Only did the right thing, Leona, that's all." "Most people don't," I said, "even when it's right in front of them." We sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee, looking out at the fields that stretched toward the tree line. The same fields my father had walked, the same soil Vernon had tried to carve up and sell to strangers, the same 80 acres I'd fought a war to keep. The land hadn't changed, but everything else had. "You staying through winter?" Boyd asked. "Planning to," I said. "Flynn's helping me weatherize the warehouse, thinking about what to do with it come spring." Boyd smiled a small, knowing expression. "Your daddy built that warehouse with his own hands. 42 years ago, I think. Took him a whole summer." "I remember," I said. "I was 17. He let me help with the roof." "He'd be proud of you," Boyd said simply. I didn't trust myself to answer. I just nodded. After Boyd left, I went inside and cleaned up the mugs. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as though Vernon's absence had let the walls breathe again. Forgiveness isn't a door you open or close. It's a field you stop tending, letting wild grass grow over the furrows. I thought about Thalia's key still in my coat pocket. I thought about Hugo somewhere far away, growing up in the shadow of choices he'd never made. I thought about Cressida, running from the wreckage Vernon had left behind. And I thought about Vernon himself, 61 years old, driving away with his life packed in cardboard boxes, heading toward a future that no longer included anyone who'd once called him family. I should have hated him, Maybe I had for a while, but now I just felt tired and free. 6 weeks after the verdict, Marlene called. It was evening, early December, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. I was sitting by the fireplace reading one of my father's old journals when the phone rang. Leona. Her voice was steady, normal, not the brittle defensiveness I'd heard in the courtroom. It's Marlene. Hello? I said. A pause. Then, I know I haven't been fair to you all these years. Thought Vernon was always right. Thought you were, I don't know, difficult, ungrateful. I waited. I was wrong, she said, about a lot of things. You don't need to apologize, Marlene. I do, though, she replied. Her voice on the phone held no pride, no shame, just the flat honesty of someone who'd finally stopped choosing sides. Whether you need to hear it or not, I stood by him when I should have questioned him. I doubted you when I should have listened. That's on me. I closed the journal in my lap, feeling the worn leather cover under my fingers. You testified, I said quietly, when it mattered. That took courage. Took me too damn long, she said. We talked for a few more minutes, small things, careful things. She asked about the property. I asked about her health. Neither of us pretended we'd become friends, but we weren't strangers anymore either. Something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, just release. When we hung up, I stood and walked to the window. Outside, December stars scattered across a black sky, cold and infinite. The warehouse stood in silhouette against them, the same structure my father had built with his own hands 42 years ago. I'd fought for this land, won the battle, closed the wounds. But standing there in the quiet dark, I realized something I'd never let myself admit. The fight was never really about Vernon. It was about proving to my long-dead father that I could protect what he'd entrusted to me, that I was worthy of the inheritance, that I wouldn't let strangers take what he'd spent a lifetime building. I'd spent 8 months in courtrooms and lawyers' offices, poring over documents and bank statements, facing down lies and forgeries and betrayals, all to prove I could be the guardian he'd believed I was. And now the land was mine. The 80 acres, 95 counting the parcels he'd quietly added over the years, stretched out in every direction. Dark and silent and whole. Tomorrow I'd have to decide what to actually do with it all. Not just keep it, not just protect it, but build something, leave something, make it mean something beyond the battle I'd won. Through the window, the warehouse outline stood dark against December stars. I thought about Flynn, about the motion sensor lights we'd installed together, about Grazia's steady voice on the phone, about Boyd's quiet knock that March night, about Thalia's key still waiting in my pocket, about all the people who'd helped me win a war I'd never wanted to fight. Victory is a house, I thought, but legacy is what you build inside it. I didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in 8 months, I had the space to start asking the right questions. The sound of concrete pouring is steady, patient, like everything worth building. January sunlight fell cold and bright across the property, turning frost on the grass into scattered diamonds. I stood outside the old warehouse, or what was left of it. Flynn had spent the last 3 weeks tearing it down to the foundation, salvaging what could be salvaged, planning something bigger, sturdier. He worked with the deliberate care of someone who understood that shortcuts cost more than time. The concrete mixer churned, and Flynn guided the thick gray stream into the forms he'd built, smoothing it with practiced strokes. I brought 2 glasses of lemonade and sat on an overturned crate watching my son work. He'd inherited his grandfather's hands, strong, capable, patient. The kind of hands that built things meant to last. "Mom, you think Grandpa would be pleased with this?" Flynn asked, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the January chill. I smiled. "Grandpa would say you haven't poured enough concrete." Flynn laughed, a genuine sound that echoed across the open field. "Sounds about right." He returned to work, pouring more carefully than usual over a particular section, the spot where Vernon's metal containers had once been buried. The ground had already been reconcreted once, after we'd removed them. Now Flynn was building over it again, sealing that chapter beneath layers of foundation. As I watched the concrete flow and settle, covering the place where Vernon had hidden his stolen treasure, I realized something I'd been too close to see before. My father's legacy was never the land or the warehouse. It was teaching me to fight for what matters, to stand my ground when everyone said to compromise, to dig until I found the truth, even when the truth was buried 6 feet down in metal containers. The 80 acres, the 95 acres, the warehouse, the property, lines, the forged signatures, and court battles, all of it had been a test I hadn't known I was taking until I'd passed. And now Flynn was here, building on ground his grandfather had cleared, using skills he'd learned from work his grandfather never lived to see him do. Legacy, I thought, isn't what you leave behind. It's what keeps growing after you're gone. Flynn finished the pour and stood back studying his work with critical eyes. I'm putting in full electrical, he said. LED lighting, weatherproof outlets. You'll be able to work out here year-round if you want. What would I work on? I asked. He shrugged. Whatever comes next. You think endings are about winning or losing? They're not. They're about deciding what you carry forward and what you bury in concrete. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and a pen. I didn't write to Vernon. I didn't write to Thalia. I wrote to Hugo. Dear Hugo, I began. You won't remember me, and that's probably for the best. The words came slowly. What do you say to a 4-year-old boy who'd been caught in the crossfire of adult failures? A child who'd lost the only home he'd known because his father was a thief and his mother had run. Your father tried to take something that wasn't his, I wrote. I fought to keep it. That made us enemies in a courtroom, but it doesn't have to make us enemies forever. I paused thinking about Hugo's small face in the Clarksville rental house window, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. I don't hate you, I wrote. I just defended what was mine. I hope someday you'll understand the difference. I signed it simply Leona and folded the letter into an envelope. The next morning I sent it through Grazia to Cressida's last known address. Whether it would reach him, whether Cressida would keep it or throw it away, whether Hugo would ever read it, I didn't know. But I'd written it, and that was enough. The Tuesday morning shift at Krager started the way it always did. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, the faint smell of cleaning solution mixed with fresh bread from the bakery, the steady beep of scanners waking up across the registers. I clocked in at Register 4. Same register. Same view of the parking lot through the wide front windows. Same rhythm I'd known for 14 years. Mrs. Patterson came through my line around 9, a regular customer who shopped every Tuesday, always asked about my life with the kind of genuine interest that couldn't be faked. Leona, you look completely different lately, she said, setting her reusable bags on the counter. Something good happened. I smiled and scanned her milk, her bread, her jar of apricot preserves. Nothing special. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Well, whatever it is, it suits you. After she left, I stood at my register watching the parking lot fill and empty. Cars came and went. People bought groceries. Life continued in its steady, unremarkable way. Beep, scan, bag. The rhythm of ordinary life, the most extraordinary thing I'd fought to keep. In my pocket, my hand found the new warehouse key Flynn had cut for me last week, heavier than the old one, solid steel, not brass. The weight felt good against my palm. Real. Earned. The customer in front of me cleared her throat, and I smiled, returning to work. People don't need to know what you did, I thought. You knowing is enough. I'd fought a war in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. I'd uncovered lies buried 6 feet down. I'd faced betrayal from the man I'd married and stood my ground when everyone said to compromise. I'd won back everything Vernon tried to steal, rebuilt what he'd tried to destroy, and extended grace to the innocent caught in the wreckage. And now I stood at Register 4, scanning groceries exactly where I'd been when it all started. But the warehouse key in my pocket was heavier than the old one, not burden, but proof. The greatest victory, I realized, is returning to ordinary life, knowing you're no longer ordinary inside. My hand touched the warehouse key one more time. Solid steel Flynn had cut himself. The weight felt good. The customer moved on, the next one stepped forward, and I scanned their groceries with the same steady rhythm I'd used for 14 years. Some stories end with fireworks. Mine ended with a key in a cash register. And that was exactly right. And to you listening to my story, remember this. The greatest strength isn't in the fight you win, but in knowing when to stand your ground. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner. There were signs I ignored, small inconsistencies, unexplained absences, the way Vernon's eyes wouldn't meet mine. I told myself I was being paranoid that marriage meant giving benefit of the doubt. Don't make my mistake. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Your gut knows before your heart is ready to accept it. What I learned from revenge cheating stories like mine is this: justice isn't about destroying the person who hurt you, it's about protecting what's rightfully yours. So many true family stories end with the victim staying silent, accepting betrayal as the price of peace. I refused. I fought for my father's land, for my dignity, for the truth. These revenge cheating stories that end in courtrooms instead of quiet surrender, they matter. They show that standing up is possible. True family stories aren't always about forgiveness. Sometimes they're about boundaries. And I believe God put me through this test not to break me, but to show me I was stronger than I ever knew. If my story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Have you faced a moment where you had to choose between peace and justice? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more revenge cheating stories and true family stories like this one, subscribe to Her Vengeance. Thank you for staying until the very end. Some details here have been fictionalized for storytelling, but the core message, standing your ground, that's real. God bless you.